Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from Vancouver or British Columbia. I'm Ben Moraine. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund of Canada. Thank you for joining us today between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when I'm sure you will have lots of things to do, lots of family time and lots of reflecting of your own. Thank you for joining us during these 10 days of repentance for an opportunity to reflect on what our Jewish values mean to us and how we can continue to take action on those values in the year ahead. It's really nice to see joining us people from the West Coast. Leonard, nice to see you here. People from Toronto, Lenka, nice to see you as always. Great to see you, Ephraim, and many people from across the country in Ottawa. Sari and Neil, great to see you too. Before we jump in, let me just acknowledge the lands on which we sit. I'd like to acknowledge that Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And today, the meeting place of Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to work and live on this land. So wherever you sit, I encourage you to think about the lands on which you dwell. Thank you. I know that many of you joining us are longtime friends of ours here at the New Israel Fund of Canada, but for those of you who may be new, let me explain a little bit about what we are. We'll explain our perspective on what's happening in Israel, and then I'm going to introduce you to a couple of inspiring activists, recipients of funding from the New Israel Fund of Canada that are part of the broad and inspiring pro-democracy movement in Israel right now. So for those of you who are less familiar, the New Israel Fund of Canada protects and advances democracy and equality in Israel. We reworded our tagline a decade ago: protects and advances democracy and equality in Israel. 10 years ago, we saw that democracy was weakening in Israel. And so we've done what we have always done for the past 40 years. We support projects and programs in Israel that fight for social and economic justice, religious freedom, civil and human rights, shared society between Jewish and Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, fight anti-racism, stand up for the equality of all citizens, and defend democracy itself. First, so many of the reasons that so many of the rights that are under threat in Israel right now, the reasons that we're proud of Israel's democracy today, are the result of decades of Israelis fighting tooth and nail to improve their society. For example, legislation for disability rights, court precedents protecting women's and minority rights, etc. These were won by Israelis, by civil society, at the court, at the steps of the Supreme Court, or in the halls of the legislature, or in the grassroots of cities across Israel. So many of the things we're proud of today in Israel are the result of organizations and Israelis that the New Israel Fund has funded. And second, so many of the Israelis today on the ground right now fighting for Jewish and progressive values, including democracy and including issues like ending the occupation, are funded, trained, and coordinated with us. That's what we do. On the one hand, we fund civil society groups, but also half of our work on the ground is training and coordinating Israel's social change sector. So what are we doing at this, when this government got elected? We do what we always do. We support a bold and vibrant and diverse opposition to extremism, to majoritarian rule, and to things that threaten the rights and equality of all people living in Israel. We've been supporting groups, individuals, activists, institutions that are opposing this government's radical agenda and calling attention to its consequences for Israel. So we've been doing primarily three things. We've been issuing rapid response funding to individual new organizations, new projects that have been coming up out of the grassroots to confront emerging threats from the government, and also to take advantage of this incredible groundswell, to turbo fuel this incredible groundswell of civil society response. The second thing is we've been coordinating and protecting civil society. Our funding is helping pro-democracy organizations and activists mobilize every sector to map threats, to respond in unison, and to, yes, operate safely amid this government's efforts to silence or even outlaw their activities. And the third thing we've been doing is that we've been investing and backing initiatives that strengthen the vision, the ideas, and the kind of leadership needed in the long term to turn Israel around and to secure liberal democracy and a just and inclusive society in the long term. So what we're doing here today, I'm excited to introduce you to a couple of our guests who are the recipients of one of these emergency grants that we at the New Israel Fund of Canada have funded. I'm excited to introduce you to the Faithful Left. There's been a lot of attention on saving democracy and pushing back on Jewish extremism and indeed Jewish supremacy. It's easy to point to, say, the courts, the media, the other safeguards of a liberal democracy. It's easy to talk about checks and balances and what we're losing and what we need to preserve. It's a little harder to point how we're going to save Jewishness or save Judaism from Jewish supremacy. We believe in a Jewish and democratic state. It's easy to say that this is how we're going to save democracy, the democratic part. How are we going to save the Jewish part from the jaws of the people who claim to represent Jewish in the government right now? So to dive into just one powerful example of what that looks like and sounds like, let me introduce Brit and Michael, who will share what inspired them to create something new in this moment, what challenges they faced, and what lies ahead. Michael Mankin is the director of the Alliance Fellowship Program, a Jewish Arab political network in Israel. Before running the Alliance, Michael served as the director of Molad, a nonpartisan think tank in Jerusalem focused on democratic change in Israel. And prior to that, Michael was the executive director of Breaking the Silence. A couple years ago, Michael published the book Athalta, if I am pronouncing that correctly, Ethics and Tradition in a Time of Power. The book is set to come out in English later this year. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife and 3 children. Longtime friend, Michael, great to see you. Also a close friend of ours, many of you may remember Brit Yacobi. Brit is now the Director of Religious Freedom and Gender at Shatil. No, this is a slightly old bio. You are now the Grants Officer for Religious Freedom and at the New Israel Fund of Canada. And before that, she was the Director of Religious Freedom in the action arm or capacity building arm called Shatil that many of you are familiar with. Before that, she was Director of Education at Jewish Pluralism Watch of the Israeli Masorti movement. Also founded Free Space, a project that runs Jewish cultural events in abandoned synagogues in Tel Aviv. She has a BA in Talmud and an MA in Jewish and Gender Studies. So let's dive in. Brit and Michael, we're delighted to have you. This is not your first Canadian webinar. It's not your first NIF webinar, so many people are familiar with you. But just for the benefit of those new joining us today, would you just tell us a little bit about yourselves, maybe some background that people are less familiar with in your relation to the Faithful Left?
Michael, you want to start?
Okay. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Maybe I'll just add that all the organizations that Ben mentioned that I've had the wonderful privilege and opportunity to be part of or to direct are organizations that were funded by, and most are still funded by the New Israel Fund. So I've really had the opportunity to benefit from NIF support for probably the last 2 decades, which is very heartwarming. And from an Israeli activist perspective, on this side, I think there's no place where you move sort of in our field and you don't encounter the New Israel Fund directly. So thank you all for being on this call and for support. Maybe I'll just say to kick us off by way of introduction that I see myself as sort of an anti-occupation activist. And while my faith, I'm an Orthodox Jew, while my faith has always been sort of relevant to my political activists, I haven't really, I wasn't really vocal about it. And these last couple of years, and definitely since this last election, I felt and we felt that the need to be more public about our tradition and why we view the place of our tradition is so significant in fighting against inequality. That place has grown immensely. primarily because the religious right has such a strong hold over language of religion in this country. So while those issues manifest themselves on issues like occupation or gender rights or economic inequality or all sorts of other things, because they're happening in the name of religion, religion and definitely orthodoxy have become synonymous with right-wing hypernationalism. So for me, I've always felt that faith plays a significant role, but speaking about that and trying to organize around that is relatively new for a whole bunch of us. So by way of introduction, maybe that's the only thing that I would throw in here. And Ben mentioned Atchalta, which I wrote about this topic. In English, it's translated to End of Days. So I guess that makes it easy, at least for introductions, to say, and it should be out in November in English. Yeah. Brit?
Nice. So hi. First, I need to apologize because like this time in Jerusalem, it's like really loud in the street. So I don't know if you hear. I hope you're not. Oh my God, great. So there are concert outside just started. Okay, great. So if you will hear it, I'm sorry. So as Ben said, in the last 5 years, I had the opportunity to work really closely with NIF Canada when I managed the Forum Against Women's Segregation and a lot of gender issues. And for me, it's also a great opportunity not to speak from both like sides. One is as like NIF worker, and the other is as organization that got a grant from NIF. So from both perspective, maybe I'll say something about myself. As Michael, I also grew up in the religious Zionist community. My family is Mizrahi, so it's a bit different. I grew up in Ramat Gan. I was the head of the youth movement of the Likud party. So as you can imagine, I did a bit shift in my opinion during my life. And I find it important because kind of what me and Michael trying to do, it's also to speak with the community that for many years, part of the left camp didn't spoke with. We understand why, but we're trying to come back to our community, to the Mizrahi community, to the Masorti community, the traditional community, the religious Zionist community, and also the Haredi community, which both of us not coming from this community, but we have other colleagues that coming from that place and trying to be kind of bridge between these worlds. But maybe we'll speak about it later.
Well, both of you come from like communities that, like, in a stereotype, like these are not left or liberal communities, and in fact, in like the way that we sort of shorthand the tribes in Israel, like being religious and left is mutually exclusive. And while it's true that, well, we'll get into that. We'll pull that apart a little bit later. But like, let's just flash backwards to when this government got elected. You know, I know that the two of you have been watching these symptoms of illiberalism and populism growing because we've been working together for years already. And it's interesting that you've been a part of other civil society responses. You've been a part of many social change institutions and initiatives, but you've done something different now by deciding to come to foreground another piece of your identity and step into what seems iconoclastic. What was it about this government as it came to be that made you feel like this was a step that you hadn't taken and needed to take? Like, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did that motivate you to do what you are doing now?
Brit?
Okay. So first I'll say it was day after the election when Michael called me and Michal Chernovitsky, other colleague of us, Haredi, feminist Haredi women, and said, like, we need to do something. And in the beginning, when Michael said something like that, so the answer is always yes, but I didn't understand actually what we're going to do. But we felt this government that just elected, the judicial reform was not even like on the table. So it was only about this current government, and we understand this government going to be the most religious government Israel ever had, and also the most extreme right government. So we felt it's a momentum, and it's also a wake-up call for a lot of people in our community that was not speaking, like some of them not even like seemed themselves as lefties, others that seemed themselves as lefties doesn't like really understand the connection between being religious and our lefty idea. I can say about myself, like for my whole life, it's like two different parts. And we felt it's like this government, it's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call for many years that our community change and shift and get more nationalistic and more, that we see more radicalization. It doesn't start in this government, but this was some, like, I felt it was a wake-up call for us, but also we saw it's a momentum for a lot of people that I'm not sure maybe they won't come in a different timing. I don't know, Michael, you see it, if you see it just like that. I just tell, we bring 800 people to this conference in Jerusalem, that the keynote speaker was Rabbi Adina Bar Shalom, the daughter of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and by herself, she's the really brave Haredi activist. So I also
just want to
felt
pause. Just like for those of our listeners who are not aware of the significance of that person, like Brie, do you want to like unpack a little bit like who that incredible woman is?
Yeah, she, as I said, she's the youngest daughter of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, maybe the most important rabbi in the 21st century, or one of the most important rabbis in the 21st century. And by herself, she won the Israeli prize. She really in the mainstream of Israel, and she said out loud on the stage, she said, like, not in my name, not in my father's name. It was really important, and it's bring a lot of traffic, but there are also a lot of other amazing speakers, but she was, I think, the most surprising thing.
Yeah, this is the daughter of the spiritual leader of Shas. I think more people are familiar with the ultra-Orthodox, Sephardi party in Israel, which is, again, not a force that in shorthand we recognize as like a liberal partner or even a centrist partner. Having someone on stage like that, the daughter of someone like that whose legacy they're carrying, and saying not in my father's name, enormously significant for many people. And you said that 700 people ultimately came, but when you began doing that, like, what was your original vision? You were like, how many people do you think you'd get?
We thought we're gonna do some conference in some synagogue for 200 people, that we will know everyone, that it will be like for our friends, like activists that work in the civil society and need like be together. And we understand there like a lot of other people that need to be together. We saw in this conference, it actually was pretty shocking to see a lot of young people, like new face, young people from midrashot and yeshiva all over the country, people from the periphery that came. We bring 2 buses, one from the north and one from the south. We see a lot of Haredi, even like young Haredi from yeshiva. We see also a lot of familiar face, which is like, it was nice gathering together, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi. I felt it was really diverse. It's also like maybe the first time that we saw ourselves as like as a camp, as a faithful camp. Like we don't see it from only the perspective of religious Zionist community. We understand that as our government, maybe I need to say something about the name and I'll continue, but we actually thought a lot how to call this conference. And Esti Shushan, she also Haredi feminist activist, amazing. She she said maybe we'll call it the faithful left. It's in Hebrew, it works much better, Smol Emuni, and it's kind of reclaiming because the right camp call himself the faithful camp. Like what connected between Netanyahu, the Haredi, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, it also only the narrative that they are the only one who care about like the Judaism, the faith, and etc. So we did kind of reclaiming by call it also left, which in Israel it's always in a bad meaning. So we actually did kind of reclaiming, and I believe it's also like sounds interesting and bring a lot of people. So we try to do it not only for religious Zionist community, to say all the faithful camp. It's include Haredi, it's include modern Orthodox, religious Zionist, Masorti in the way of tradition. It's together it's 40% of the Israeli society.
Yeah, I just
Michael?
want to throw up a picture. Like, this is the conference. Like, this is you thought you were going to get a couple hundred people, and here, this is a full amphitheater.
Yeah, in the building in which historically housed the rabbinate of Israel. I will say, if you asked about the beginning of this and maybe also lead to where we are now, I think a lot of activist endeavors usually start to solve a very like specific mood or feeling or sense that activists have, and in our case, we just wanted to create a room of people like us who we understood feel lonely versus the right. But I'll also say, with the growing insularity among the liberal camp in this country, in which where demography is becoming a threat. You'll read a lot of articles about the demographic threat in Israel, and the meaning being of religious people or religion in general. And a lot of, I think, bigotry within the liberal left camp, a lot of lack of knowledge towards a lot of communities. So things that existed before, but things that are very heightened now for reasons which we might be able to understand, but I don't think we should accept. So the initial desire was really to just get a room of people that we know and we love, and to tell people like ourselves we're not alone. And we just understood through the conference that we're not alone is much greater than the people we know. And then we realized, again, like a lot of these endeavors, that we have responsibility to continue the voice going. So aside from running an annual conference, which we plan to do, and we have another 4 months or 5 months for the next one. But it's really being present. I would say really doing two things systematically. A is being present as much as possible for our community. So that means holding events at least once a month around holidays or around screenings of movies or activist endeavors in general, and just being there, and also being present at the protest as a group, and showing ourselves to ourselves and also to the people around us, and making our making our community known. And the second part, which is equally important, is really trying to learn deeply our Torah as activists, and trying to understand, wait a minute, what are our sources which inspire us? How do we deal with the sources that maybe we're more embarrassed about? So really having that conversation, we feel is necessary. So it's a lot of just very sort of old school community building, but we feel which is particularly important at the time that we're at now.
This, I think something that you just said a second ago about showing yourselves to yourselves was struck a chord with me, because I think here in the diaspora, particularly in Canada, I think many Canadian Jews look out at, say, the United States Jewish community or the United Kingdom Jewish community, other places where their Jewish institutions have been particularly outspoken major federations or major institutions, big synagogues, have taken a stand against this government's judicial overhaul or other things. They've spoken out against the pogroms in Huara and other places by settlers in the West Bank. And it hasn't quite unfolded quite that same way in Canada, where a lot of the major institutions remain really quiet. Earlier this year, New Israel Fund and our partner JSpace published an opinion poll that revealed that actually the vast majority of Canadian Jews, by overwhelming numbers, oppose all those policies, oppose, there was talk about ending a grandfather clause of the law of return, the judicial overhaul, the right to vote for Arab citizens, or representation in the Knesset for Arab citizens, like you name it, the whole wish list of their majoritarian, autocratic, and even theocratic, wish list. Canadian Jews oppose those by like 65%, 75%, 80%. Across the board, regardless of where they lived or their religiousness. And yet we also feel, I think that this is the moment where we also need to see ourselves as well as be seen by the wider, global Jewish community, by Israelis, but especially by other Canadian Jews. This is also something that we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I totally hear that, and I think a lot of times, I mean, it's also about sort of our responsibility as activists and communities. So we can be frustrated with how our community is seen towards the outside, and we talk a lot amongst ourselves that if we were, if I was just an Israeli disconnected to religion, and not necessarily in contact, then I would have very probably critical views of how I view sort of religion and religious tradition in this country, and I could be frustrated with that of lack of knowledge all day. But I think our role and responsibility as activists or engaged, individuals in our community is to actually work really hard to create a more public vision. So and those areas are usually where one, I think, becomes more optimistic. None of us are romantic about where we are demographically in terms of our community, and we're aware that there's been a lot of work done over the last many decades to marginalize, the Torah that we speak in the name of. That being said, these times do present great opportunities for people like ourselves, and I agree with what Brit said before, that if that the fact that so many people came to our conference, even though it was very upfront on combating occupation, we were upfront about LGBT rights, we were upfront about land reform, all sorts of issues which you wouldn't expect, Haredi and Orthodox Jews to run forward. I think the fact that there's such justified anxiety about the right-wing leadership of the country allowed people to maybe encourage, sort of push themselves a bit to areas where maybe in the past it'd be less comfortable. And I think we need to seize upon that opportunity.
So just to like dive in a little bit too. So you're doing meetings, you're doing education, you're representing at the democracy protests. But what's the content of that? How do you reconcile what this government claims is Jewish with your own Jewish values? Like, how do we take Jewish back from Jewish supremacy?
So if I'll come back to the day after, like the conference, so we bring a lot of people to the conference, and it was momentum and a lot of media. And then people ask, okay, what is this movement gonna do? And actually, then I think was the first time we understand that we're actually a movement, because before we just think we'll do a conference, and we understand it can't like stop in this conference. And since then I feel like we did a lot of intuitive work, but also we're trying to like build a theory of change and build actually a movement, a sustainable movement. So we do it both. We start like with strategically work, but also we did like in the last half of years a lot of like, I think, intuitively work. Our intuition, it's they're fine. but I think our strategies work both ways. It's like top down and bottom up. Like in the bottom up, we understand we need to build community. It's community that will be a place for people that are religious and feel that they are need a place to be against this government, be like seek for equality, peace, and justice. And we not only like want to bring the people that already like connect to us, we're gonna do it bigger and bigger. So this is one step. This is the community, and I think community building it's super important. I can say, like, from my Shatil perspective, that I saw other communities like build their communities, and together today you can't think about movement without like actually build community. Like you can't work only with the leaders. So we do a lot of community work. In the other end, we understand that there are a lack of leadership. We saw it when we we called, I think we can say it, right, Michael? We called like a lot of rabbis and like religious leaders, asking them, like people that, you know, they agree with us in our values, and they're really afraid to speak in this conference. Before they thought it will be something big. And we understand that there are a lack of like brave community, brave leadership that will like speak clearly about these topics. We also saw it a day after Hawara, which like there was like only few rabbis that say something clear against the violence, and it's not like really lefty thing to say something against violence that happened from your community.
Yeah,
so we understand.
Just so the listeners remember what we're talking about, you know, Hawara was, it's a Palestinian village in the West Bank with a settlement nearby. And, you know, it was back at the end of March. I think we were all shocked and horrified to see, you know, a few hundred settlers enter this village, burn cars, torch houses, carrying weapons, threaten individuals. And the news says that, you know, 1 or 2 people lost their lives in unclear circumstances. But I, you know, Palestinians, residents of that village, lost their lives. I think it's sad to say that was not the last of those incidences of such riots that went through, Jewish extremists went through Palestinian villages.
So Hawara, it was actually, I can think it was a pogrom after a terror attack. And like I was like day after, we were shocked that none of the rabbis said something clear about like the violence for people from our community. So we also like want to build leadership, and we work on like build a think tank, build a leadership that will be brave enough, but also to strengthen the voice of the people that already exist and make them be more powerful in our community. And we see our community as kind of like agent of change to these ideas. And maybe I'll say something like other like strategy that we see this, we target this government, but we also like think really far, and we understand it like need to be both. We need to be like a clear voice right now against this government in the rally, the demonstration, in the media, everything that happened. But also we understand that it's really long-term mission, and we're working on building curriculum for schools. We really believe in education, and we understand the damage this government did already like does. So it's even if she will fall, and she will fall, like I don't know if it's take like I hope few months, but maybe it will take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Like it won't exist like till I don't know, till the end of I don't know. But the ideas, the values, the violence, the racism will continue in our community. And I believe if we won't do something, if we won't do any change, so it's just like get bigger to all the Israel community. We already see it. So we think also for long-term strategy, working inside the education system and etc. We have a Bet Midrash. Actually, we have a lot of maybe Michael, you can like add.
Just to what we spoke about earlier, we really believe the educational component of this and the learning component of this is key, and that might seem strange from an outside perspective. The first thing we did after the conference was actually start arranging classes and learn, but we really feel we need a solid understanding of our tradition, and more importantly, that you can't really do anything religious in the long run without having an element of learning involved. It's just part of the way the tradition works. And maybe I want, we're talking internally about what we're doing as a faithful left, and what might be perceived as the fact that this is strange or new, or maybe or maybe odd. But I do want to stress that we're all activists coming from left spaces. And if you look at anti-occupation in this country, both historically and now as an example, that's just a world I know a bit more. There have actually been a lot of religious people in that community. So a lot of times when we say, oh, and we joke a lot about this in the left, that people are always, say they're surprised to see people like us. A lot of times it's because of their lack of knowledge and not necessarily because we don't exist. So it's important for me to point out to that fact that, this isn't some new phenomenon. It's just some people haven't, maybe necessarily opened their eyes wide enough or realized who they've been talking to in the last couple of years. As somebody who comes from breaking the silence, I could say that so many of that organization, come from religious backgrounds. It's just not something that is discussed openly. So the stigma continues to be the stigma. So maybe part of what we're doing should invite people to just look around at the camp as it is already and notice that it's actually more, it's less homogenic than what people suggest, or what papers like Haaretz suggest.
That my next question was like, does faithful left have anything to say to the secular left? And I think you just wrote a nice little letter to the editor of Haaretz right there.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like it's also a long standing frustration of a lot of us, and we're at we're literally coming from a day where just recently, like on Twitter, when Haaretz opinion editors wrote some very, very bigoted anti-religious sentiments, and I think if it would happen in any other paper in this country or about any other community in this country, then she would be told to apologize. But the fact is that there is a lot of anti-religious sentiment, and again, while we're clear that the face of hyper-nationalism in this country, to the most part, is religious, and most of our lives we spend fighting that, it's also important for us to remind the public around us that what we want is democracy and equality. What we don't want is tribe versus tribe, in some sort of never-ending wrestling match. For me, I care about civic rights and national rights and LGBT rights or gender rights in general, and economic rights, regardless of whether it's Jewish or Arab or religious or secular or Mizrahi or Ashkenazi and so on and so forth. This isn't a fight of a community against a community. This is a fight, or should be a fight, about values, and that's something that's important for us to constantly stress. And I think it's a challenge within our camp about who do we see as our camp and who do we see as the other. And it's a deep frustration that some of us can be involved for decades in our life in sort of central organizations or leading organizations in the left, and yet we're still considered others by the powers that be or by those who decide the conversation because for sociological reasons. So I think our camp also has a lot to sort of think about. I don't view what we're doing as reaching out to externally from outside of our camp. I view what we're doing as fighting for the values of our, fighting for our values and beliefs in a language which makes more sense for our community. This isn't a reaching out to enlarge the left project. This is just us doing us communally and not individually.
And maybe I can add, Michal, I really agree. And I believe also because of the important place of Judaism in the public sphere of Israel, I believe that what we are doing is also important for secular people who are like this government also bring them like a lot of hate. And I understand the hate for Judaism, but just like remember ourselves that there can be other values from the Judaism, which like equality and justice are not less core values than, I don't know, racism. So I don't know, like it's also about who represent the Judaism. And I believe like Ben Gvir is minority, but he's so super powerful minority. So we are also minority in our community, but we want to be this voice, want to be powerful and bring other voice. Like we don't say like everything in decided Judaism is like amazing. And as Michal said, we're not romantic for like the values that's coming from Judaism. We have a lot of like criticism, I think, about like the place we are, but just like other, like I don't know, other understand other communities we're part of. So I believe like our mission is also important for a lot of secular people. We actually saw a lot of secular people in the conference.
Here, I wanna invite our guests, our attendees, those of you listening, if you'd like to ask questions of our speakers, I would really like you to put them in the chat. Because we want to end this right on the hour today. We won't be taking questions from the audience, just it takes us a little bit of extra time. So please write a few questions in the chat for us to get to. Mika, let's save your like our final question for the very end before we go. So while we're waiting for people to write some questions, I noticed something earlier this year that I would like to ask as my to get us going. I noticed earlier in the year this was probably April or so, there was a moment in which the mass protests began directing their attention, or some, perhaps you can clarify, began to direct some of their attention to the Haredi welfare that was going through the budget, like the huge amount of new money for that sector. And we noticed that there was some presumably secular anger directed from the protesters at the Haredi community. And then something really interesting happened. Omdim B'Yachad, which is another NIF-funded group, a Jewish Palestinian group, issued a statement saying that we will stand with our Haredi brethren against stereotyping and scapegoating and calling them cockroaches and things, parasites, that this is not acceptable for us in this moment. I want to get your read on what you think about that moment.
Well, it's interesting because it was actually a more complex conversation within our group. We have a lot of people who come from ultra-Orthodox world, and we're actually more sort of questioned the engagement, even on negative terms between Tel Aviv and Bnei Brak, and didn't necessarily throw it outright. Because they understand that there's a need for a conversation, even if it's negative. And I would say from us, the long-standing frustration is treating the ultra-Orthodox community as an other, and then dealing with its leadership, instead of understanding that these are citizens and they have rights. Just like every other citizen. I think the most important question, for example, is education, in which education in the ultra-Orthodox sector is privately run, state-funded, but privately run. And that means it primarily hurts, from our perspective, ultra-Orthodox women and ultra-Orthodox children and ultra-Orthodox teachers. So the question isn't, I think, do we want to save the ultra-Orthodox community from themselves, but are we responsible towards all members of our society? And I think for too long we see, or Israelis see, ultra-Orthodox community as an other, which either you need to to deal with, or you need to save. And we think there's another option, which is not seeing us or them as an other. The ultra-Orthodox activists in our group, primarily the Haredi activists, are some of the most brave people I know. And working in the ultra-Orthodox sphere has not made them less ultra-Orthodox. A lot of times people perceive any positive thing that an ultra-Orthodox activist does as sort of moving a step out of the ultra-Orthodox community. And we see the exact opposite, that it's actually a way to engage. So that's maybe regarding the ultra-Orthodox community. And is it okay if I just sort of deal with some of the questions very quickly and then maybe Brit can add as well? Okay, because I've been reading them. Sorry, it helps my ADHD to have questions coming at me while I answer something else. I will say that we're actually, one of our main, regarding engagement with Palestinians, one of our main lines of activity is actually working in Hebron. We're there once every couple of weeks as activists in a subset of the faithful left called Children of Abraham. Sometimes we get press when some of our activists are hit by soldiers, which happened last year, sadly. But more importantly, we actually do a lot of work just regarding sort of issues like land rights, settlement encroaching on private land, and that kind of thing. And I would say that when we're there, we don't talk necessarily about religion. We talk about food and the weather and like a soccer match or what's happening on the ground. The fact that we're religious people and that they're traditional doesn't mean that we necessarily do that. And I will say that it's not strange for them that we're religious. I think it's only strange for secular Jews that religious Jews come to Hebron. for the Palestinians in Hebron, it's strange that Israelis come, but it doesn't make it more strange that I'm wearing a kippah. And regarding the question about I don't think we view ourselves as saving religious Judaism. I think we view ourselves as just being religious Jews. It's really more about being part of our tradition. And I would say that probably, I don't know what necessarily differs us, but what's important for us to stress are two elements. A is that we're not a religious Zionist institution or a movement, but rather we're faith-based, and there are people who come from religious Zionist circles, but also people who come, as Brit said, from Haredi circles, Mizrahim or Sarti circles, and really the faith is standing at the end. And then maybe the second thing is I don't think we view ourselves as moderate. We're not trying to moderate radical religious right. We're trying, if anything, I think we're trying to polarize. I don't think we view moderacy as necessarily something that's important to us. I think sometimes it's really good to be an extremist as long as you're fighting for the right causes. I think moderacy as a political guideline is sometimes overrated. So I know that's maybe not the healthiest thing to say sometimes, but I don't want to moderately combat occupation. I want to radically combat education. I don't want to moderately fight for gender inequality. I want to radically fight for it. Or extremely fight for it, and I think that probably makes us different in terms of our ethos than maybe the moderate groups that existed before us. Brit?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think we're both radical people. So, but I can say also, like, we're not in these two ways we are different, but in other ways we are just continue for a lot of things. We didn't create everything from the beginning. We're I think new generation. Like for many years it was really silence in this area, and we really appreciate, and we are in a good connection with all the legacy people of the religious left community, and we see ourselves like as continue from a lot of things that happen. Actually, like in your pitch, Michael, you mentioned all these rabbis and all these religious leaders that we are like see ourselves as continue to them. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Leibovich, Nechama Leibovich, and etc. Heschel, and we're not creating everything like from scratch. And if I'll just answer to Barbara's second question about like our allies. So we see ourselves also like there are other amazing organizations in the ecosystem of the religious community, religious LGBT, that for years NIF work with feminist religious organization, Haredi organization, and we see ourselves also as kind of umbrella for this organization. We're not speaking only from one perspective or one topic. We want to bring community also for this organization, and actually we are in really good connection. For years I working with this organization, leading forums with like we all guarantees of the New Israel Fund. So they're amazing ecosystem of religious liberal organization, Tag Meir and etc., Haredi organization, Mizrahi organization, and also I think we see ourselves as allies of a lot of like not religious organization. Bnei Avraham is in a collaboration with Breaking the Silence, Shovrim Shtika, and others. Actually, like we really love collaboration, so we see a lot of allies.
There was one question about relating to say Meimad or Rav Lichtenstein, and then I think we're gonna wrap up. Either of you want to take?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is a common I think a common understanding in our beautiful Jewish tradition that the rabbis come last. I hope I really hope that that rabbis with serious caliber and credentials will step up. At this point, as Brit said, and we need to be honest about it, I think there are rabbis who have spoken to us very privately and said how they like what we do, but so far the leading voices have been voices of activists, by the way, primarily women activists. And those are the voices which have been much more, excuse me, those are the voices who have been much more vocal from the get-go. And our feeling is that when the atmosphere will perhaps be safer, or people will feel that they have more of a community to speak, then rabbis will step up. And we hope that happens, and we'll welcome them openly. And it is worth mentioning that some of the most important religious trends, negative trends in this country over the last 20, 30 years have been run by activists and not by rabbinic leadership. So an example I think that is probably the most acute is going up to Temple Mount, and the whole Temple Mount movement, which is in our eyes, terrible and dangerous, and also very much not in line with our tradition. But rabbis only came 15, 20 years later after that movement started, as young activists started coming up. So that's regarding Meimad, and it's regarding Rav Lichtenstein Zitzel. But the hope is that the more we're able to create the space for these rabbis to come forward, then their voice could be a welcome addition. Even though I'd like rabbis to primarily work on on Torah and maybe perhaps less on politics. That'll also be a healthy move forward.
There's a great debate there already.
There you go.
Well, here, let's just because we're entering the final days of our own reflections before we reach Yom Kippur, and you guys have been tilling the Torah for things that are tradition rooted and reflect progressive values. So I think we'd really be curious, we'd appreciate any offering you can give, any little piece that may help us as we also think about our values, taking action in the year to come.
Sure. Well, I can try, but but I will say that that I think part of what we try to do and pushing ourselves is actually thinking about the 1 second. One of the things that we've actually been thinking, learning a lot and trying to learn more of within our tradition is actually more voices of Musar and ethical voices. So you have people like the German pietists in the 12th century, or the Tzfat capitalists in the 16th century, all of which were so focused on on the question of human behavior and individual behavior and ethical behavior as a means of attaining holiness. And one of the texts that we were studying a lot is a text of a rabbi who's actually buried in Hebron. His name is the Reshit Chochmah, and a lot of what he focuses, or Davidash, his book is called the Reshit Chochmah, and we call him after his book, as is customary in tradition. And a lot of what he focuses on is on repentance, and a lot of what he focuses on within repentance is on fasting. And it's interesting because I think in the modern it was interesting for us because I think in the modern concept of fasting is really a preparation for thinking emotionally differently. It's not a thing in its own. It's more of a method to sort of clean ourselves and to think about repentance on an emotional level. And for him, it's actually the opposite. The fasting is a center. He's actually really, really big on fasting and on sustained fasting. And it was interesting to see why. And he says pretty upfront that from his perspective, sin does not stem from poverty, but rather stems from wealth. And when people have things and when people have too many things, that is when they start behaving poorly. And I think that's the anti-modern conception of when crime happens. For him, crime happens as a result of wealth, not as a result of poverty. And the reason we fast is to actually put ourselves in a place of hunger, because when we have too much, then we start acting crudely and we start acting violently. So I think from our perspective, as Israelis who have been very blessed and fortunate to be born into a generation when Israelis have a tremendous amount of power and security and wealth, definitely compared to where we were in the past or in Jewish past, it's very easy to forget that with that wealth and with that security can come sin by forms of taking away wealth and taking away security from others, be it Palestinians or be it poor people or be it people who just happen to be born without what we have. So part of fasting on Yom Kippur will actually be to feel that physical hunger and to remind ourselves that the source of our moral perversions today in Israel stem from what we have, and there are challenges to try to get rid sometimes of what is very comfortably ours. So I don't know if that's a very light way to end this conversation, but I don't think traditional Jewry, and definitely not this time of year, excels in being light. I do think it excels in being honest and really forcing us to reconcile with who we are, and really moving that thought into action. So I think what's important is that that Yom Kippur we fast, but Motzei Yom Kippur we get back to activism again. So yeah, that's maybe a thought for Yom Kippur. And thanks again, I mean, for coming. He's taken an hour. It's pretty impressive. Thanks.
Yasher koach, yasher kochacha to both of you for doing the work you're doing. We are enormously proud that Canada is underwriting this second emergency grant that you've received in order to do this work, continue it, and build this movement. For those of you who are watching, we get to consider also ourselves to what extent we are a part of the pro-democracy movement and what identities we bring to the fore for ourselves. I consider myself a member of the religious left, and if you do too, or if you think that there are others that really would really identify with this, who would really like the story of seeing these kinds of Israelis stand up in this moment, amongst all the diversity of other Israelis also standing up in this moment, I've just put in the chat a link to like a statement that you can share with other people. If there's one thing you can do, obviously you can give a few shekels to the New Israel Fund. That's what we do. That's our core work. In this moment, it's also important that we reach other people and new people, and that we bring in the great many Canadian Jews and others who are upset by what they're seeing in Israel. There is a chance here to build a bigger movement, to not only forestall what we see that is bad happening now, but also to build a wider, bigger, stronger, more connected, mobilized community here at home to support people like Brit and people like Michael and people like the many others that we are supporting from afar. So please consider sharing that link with others. Please remember us as you think about your tzedakah in making your plans for forgiveness and repentance. And at year's end, thank you all who already support us in the many ways that you support us. Gamar Chatima Tova, may you be inscribed for goodness, and may we have a coming year where the forces of democracy and equality ultimately prevail. Thank you all. Bye, Brit. Bye, Michael. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.